In today's first reading, Solomon prays for a gift of an understanding heart, the gift of a discerning heart. St. Paul assures us that God is working in all things for those whose hearts are alive to the gift of God's love. And Jesus insists that the experience of God's kingdom, taking flesh in our world, demands from us a bold, decisive and single-minded response. Our opening prayer of today's Mass, we ask God to open our eyes to see his hand at work in the splendour of creation and in the beauty of human life. We ask God to help us to see that the world touched by his creating hand is holy. In that prayer, we are really standing with Solomon as he asks God to give him an understanding heart. We need discerning hearts to see God at work all around us. We need to learn what it is to have a heart that sees if we are going to be able to recognize the pearl of great price that we long for when we find it. The New Testament scholar Dan Harrington tells us that Jesus is using today's parables of the treasure buried in the field and the pearl of great price to teach us something simple and something fundamental about the kingdom of God. God's kingdom is something of extraordinary value, and our encounter with God's kingdom calls forth from us a single-minded response of total commitment. All of the parables Jesus tells are designed to tease us into a creative thought about what the reality of God's kingdom is about. As we let our minds and our hearts wrestle with the parables we've heard, we need to recognize that God's kingdom is not a place. Instead, God's kingdom is God's exercise of loving care over creation and creation's response to God's loving care. In Jesus, in all that Jesus does and says, God's kingdom is given flesh in our midst. Jesus' way of living shows us what a life lived in tune with God's desires for the world looks like. We need discerning hearts to recognize the presence of God's kingdom making itself felt in our lives. And we need a single-minded boldness and focusing everything on bringing our lives in union with God's desires for us and for the world. We are invited to enter into today's parables to look for the pearl of great price and to see what buried treasure we might stumble across in our lives as we remember God's gifts in our lives with great gratitude.